For more on this, I'm joined by the historian Timothy Snyder. He's a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He's the author of several important books on freedom and on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. Professor Snyder, thank you for being with us. You know, I follow your work and your posts very closely, and once in a while I can detect a shift and a change, and I saw that on Tuesday in you. Something shook you about the president's message, as well it should have.
Yeah, what shook me was that whatever happened next, a change had already arrived. So when the president said that, the dominant response was, does he mean it? Does he not mean it? Is he going to make a deal? Is this just a tactic? Whereas what I felt inside me, and you're right, I felt it very deeply, was that this itself is a substantial change. When the commander-in-chief, when the elected president of the United States says that our intention is to carry out the destruction of entire civilization, that already has consequences. It makes things possible that weren't possible before, and it makes us more ready for something like that unless we immediately react on the ethical and the moral plane.
So this is an age-old trick. Everybody's used it. They used it in Rwanda. Hitler used it. It's being used in Gaza to dehumanize people. It's used by the Russians in Ukraine. The concept of being able to say that the other is less than you are, less than human, begins the permission structure for their destruction.
There's also the notion of civilization. I mean, he's speaking about Persian civilization, and you quite rightly say this is an ancient civilization full of wonders. But it doesn't matter whether we admire the civilization or not. What matters is the notion that there's another civilization and we can destroy it. Once you accept that, regardless of what the referent is, that can be applied anywhere. You could say, well, immigrants are another civilization, or African Americans are another civilization, or anyone is another civilization. And so it's dehumanization, as you say, but it's also creating this rhetorical instrument of civilization where implicit is the idea that we're the better one. And since we're the better one, we have the right to destroy all the other ones. That's 500 years of world history, which led to the Second World War and precisely to the Convention on Genocide. The Convention on Genocide is a turning point here, that we're no longer going to say such things about other people. We're no longer going to take it as normal that we try to destroy an entire other people.
So what do you say to people who will, because Donald Trump says so many things that there are people who say, you know what, that's just Trump being Trump. That's bluster. That's how he talks. This is a negotiating tactic. He's not actually going to do it. What is the response to people? Because sometimes that does apply to Donald Trump. Sometimes he just talks nonsense and it should be ignored. How do you distinguish this for people who say, no, this is where you come out and you say, we don't do genocide. We don't support genocide. And there are actual consequences to people who suggest genocide.
Yeah, the most important thing is to say, regardless of whether he meant it, regardless of what his intentions were, regardless of whether there was some practical effect, it doesn't matter, right? The thing itself is what matters. So when we start ascribing intentions to Mr. Trump, what we're doing is providing rationalizations for ourselves. Because if we can convince ourselves that he just meant this, he just meant that, he just meant the other thing, then we're absolving ourselves of responsibility. This is our president. This is our head of state. We elected him. And if we make excuses for those words, which not that we're excusing him so much as we're excusing ourselves, that's the important thing. And we can't excuse ourselves. We have to look at these words and say, I reject these words. Whensoever they came, wheresoever they are going, I reject these words. I reject these kinds of ideas.
You've built this model on the fact that you have studied atrocities unfolding in Nazi Germany and the collapse of democracies across Eastern Europe and the struggles that they've had. What do you recognize in what has happened in the past when dictators and authoritarians say these types of things and the thing that people miss? In other words, what's the thing that Americans shouldn't miss based on what happened on Tuesday, regardless of the fact that it didn't come to pass on Tuesday night? That's almost beside the point.
Yeah, I mean, number one is that the words, and this is a point you made very well, the words change us. If we just let them fall into us, we are changed. We normalize. We will passively normalize unless we challenge the words. And the second is the notion of orders. It was after the Second World War at Nuremberg, it was specifically decided that just following orders wasn't a defense. In other words, there are norms, there are laws, there are other things out there besides the vertical chain of command. And this is something else to note. It's not just that soldiers and officers are right to reject illegal orders. It's also the case that if they don't, they are now under the shadow of genocide, because Mr. Trump has made clear that unintention, a determinable intention of this conflict was to destroy a civilization, which means that if you destroy a bridge, if you destroy a dam, if you destroy a school, it's not just a war crime in itself. It could be construed as being part of a much larger war crime, or as you say, the crime of crimes, genocide itself.
Military officers like the retired four-star General Votel have said that officers might have to have the choice to step aside rather than execute illegal orders. Let's just talk about that for a moment, the significance of dissent, both in the military and in chambers of power. Does your history tell you, your study of history tell you that that does actually work in an environment like this?
I mean, I want to make a procedural point first, which is that you get to the situation where soldiers and officers are questioning orders because of process, not just because of morals. If you allow all the power to accumulate in the hands of one person, if, for example, there's no congressional check on these things, if there's no legal check on these things, it's much more surprising when you have everyday abuse of power that soldiers and officers are going to be put in these impossible positions. They shouldn't be, right? It should be the case that the wars are declared, that Congress is behind them, that there's some kind of a process, and then these kinds of situations are much less likely to arise. Okay, what history shows is that if you don't give soldiers some kind of legal basis, if you don't give soldiers a conversation and norms, it'll come, but it comes too late, which of course is the case of Nazi Germany. There were soldiers who had consciences and who tried to act,
sure,
but they acted ineffectively and way too late.
I'm not in the business usually of media criticism. I do my show and interview my guests and produce it. But I have to say, I've been bothered for a week. Last Sunday, the president used remarkable profanity on his social media platform, and we told our viewers, what he said. I saw a lot of characterizations of that felt like journalistic whitewashing of what he said. And that was Sunday, by the way. That wasn't even close to the most shocking thing that happened this last week. And then the same thing happened on Tuesday with Donald Trump's post. The characterizations in the effort to be sane and not say things to your viewers that they might find offensive. How do you deal with that? This is offensive stuff. Donald Trump using profanity on Sunday, talking about the Iranians, is offensive stuff. Donald Trump talking about destroying a civilization is genocidal, war crimey stuff. What do we have to do in the media to manage this?
That's such a wonderful question, because there's a very strong temptation in the media and elsewhere to imagine that there's some larger magnetic force which is going to draw this back to the normal. And so we then imagine that in whitewashing it or sane washing it or excerpting it or editing it, we are somehow just taking part in a normal process and we're actually helping things. But we're making things worse. People want to see things the way they are. And in the case of Mr. Trump, I think what we were seeing was a combination of desperation and the willingness to do anything. And that, when you think about Sunday and Tuesday together, I just want to make this point. The fact that Mr. Trump was willing to do something or talk about doing something that was incredibly evil, that is genocide, doesn't mean that it was effective. A lot of folks want to say, well, he was just bluffing, or this profanity, this extreme language, it's just there as a tool. If so, it didn't work.
Right.
It didn't work. We managed to commit ourselves to the possibility of committing genocide and then get completely crushed in the negotiations that followed after that. And I think this is the air that has to be taken out of Mr. Trump's balloon. The fact that he's willing to talk about doing evil does not make him effective. People can recognize that this is both malicious and mendacious at the same time. And so we sully ourselves, and at the same time, we lose the war.
Well, you've kept us on the right track. It was very helpful to see your real-time analysis on this all week. It was really informative, as always, Tim. Thank you for joining us. Professor Tim Snyder is a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto.